Peter, what was Hastings like in the 40s and the 50s?
You still got the Londoners coming down as they had done before the war, but in fewer numbers, and it was struggling. I mean, the boarding houses and the promenade hotels were running half empty. You still had the little shops selling the naughty postcards and the kiss me quick sun hats, you know, and it had all of the aura of the I do like to be beside the seaside, but kept up with a sense of false jollity, you know, after the war. I hated it. I don't know why. I would sit or I'd lean on the promenade rails and gaze wistfully southwards to sunnier lands. I didn't get I didn't take to England. I'd never considered it my fatherland. I think even my father realized that it was not really the home he'd hoped to make for us. My mother loved it. I mean, she adjusted better than anyone, never having cooked in her life or done a moment's housework. She was in her 30s, but she knuckled down and she did a fantastic job. She learned to cook, she became another housewife. She was the pillar of the family, especially when my father had his nervous breakdown. Did a wonderful job. Great mother. I was very fortunate. She reminded me so much of my grandmother. But yes, she was glad to have us to herself, I suppose, after having surrendered us to her mother for such a long period. She could at last enjoy being a mother again, and she did a very good job at it. And she lived to 92, happily in Hastings. We moved out to Three Oaks. I would occasionally get her out to join me. She never went to Malaya, but she came here twice. And she went to Canada many times where my younger brother was living. But she always enjoyed being back home. Had a very strong sense of home. But for me, England was always a place I visited to see my parents. I love what, you know, British upbringing has given me. I love its civilization. I love everything British except the country. Odd, but you know, I'm very happy to call myself British, even though British expatriate.
And what about the education you received in England? Was it very different? Did you have to adjust to it?
No, I didn't find it terribly difficult. I wasn't top of the form, but I was reasonably well placed. My strongest subject always had been English and writing. I loved writing. So I always did very well in English, dreadfully at maths, and the sciences were not good. History and geography I could limp through, you know. English was my forte, and I loved art. I used to paint. But yes, I loved Hastings Grammar School. I have very fond memories of Hastings Grammar School. Kept in touch with some of its people long after I left. Yeah.
And so what happened after school? What were your kind of ambitions after school?
Well, there came a point when I was approaching my 15th birthday where my father took me aside and said that times were hard and that he couldn't afford to send me to further education. So these last years at grammar school would be my last, and I'd better make the most of them. But he kept reminding me that he'd been working since he was 14. And I ought to start thinking seriously about the real world, you know. I was pretty depressed. I thought I would have time to consider what I wanted to do and choose something I really wanted to do. And my father said, a job is not what you like doing, it's what you have to do. You don't enjoy your work, you just have to do it. And what a dreadful philosophy, you know. That's no basis for a career. But I looked around and there was virtually nothing in Hastings. I needed a job for my summer vacation to get attuned to the fact that I would eventually have to work. And the only opportunity I saw was in joining a newspaper. So I went and asked for an interview with the Bexhill-on-Sea Observer. Remember Bexhill-on-Sea? A place where the elephants go to die, you know. And Mr. Samuelson, who was this lovely elderly Jew who ran the Bexhill-on-Sea Observer, decided to take me on as an apprentice, try me out for 3 months, see if it would work. And I loved it. I used to go off and do funerals, stand at the door taking the names of everybody going in, crawling on hands and knees below the coffin to get the names off the wreaths, you know. Checking at the wedding, at the church entrance for the wedding guests and describing what the bride wore and what music was played, you know, bridal march from Lohengrin and all this nonsense. And Samuelson was sort of nod approvingly. And then I one day had to do an obituary for somebody who'd been very high up in the Egyptian police, but like so many retired civil servants had come down to Bexhill to die. So I was interviewing his wife, and I got all of the facts. It was quite a colourful career. And I typed up this obituary, and there was one word that escaped me, and I couldn't get it until I finally filled it in a flash. That was it. Send it into Mr. Samuelson, and 5 minutes later there was a bellow from his office, and I rushed in, and he said, "Anti-neurotics division?" It was narcotics, of course. Little things like that I remember, and the fact that I lost the office bicycle, the sacred office bicycle. That was our one and only means of transport. It was parked in the garage, which was otherwise empty, no cars or anything, just the office bicycle, and above it on a hook were a pair of bicycle clips. And I didn't realize that there was a little registry book you had to sign out for the office bicycle. Say how long you needed it, where you were going, what time you expected to return. I needed to do a funeral somewhere on the waterfront by the Dillawall Pavilion, so I went down. My first time to take the office bicycle, I took the office bicycle, I put on the bicycle clips, and I rode off to the Dillawall Pavilion. I parked the bike, went in, did the funeral, and walked back to the office. And I couldn't understand for some days what all the consternation was about, until Samuelson came to me and told me that I needed to go to the police station to find out if they'd found this bicycle. So I did, and it didn't drop. I went to the police station, and yes, they had the bicycle in question, and it had been found by the Dillawall Pavilion. At which point I finally realized what had happened. I was so abashed. I didn't ride the bicycle home. I wheeled it back to the office. I'd lost the bicycle clips. And I admitted to Samuelson that that the bicycle had been found, but I was the one responsible for having lost it. There was an absolute shocked silence. And the upper, the editorial bureau went into a huddle to decide my fate. And the only thing that swung it in my favour was the fact that I'd been honest enough to admit that I'd forgotten it. So that saved my job. That was a lovely paper. I liked the people there. Small but fun. And it was an excellent grounding for journalism. Of course, in those days, you didn't need paper qualifications, you didn't need to have gone to university or anything. You just got your next job on the basis of your past experience. But actually, I stayed with the Bexhill-on-Sea Observer until I was 18. So I was there for certainly 3 years. And then I couldn't wait to get into national service, to take me away from all this, you know. And I went to be for my medical exam, and I filled in my forms and said I wanted to be in the Royal Horse Guards. I wanted to be in an armoured car, you know, crossing the desert or something. Some far-flung outpost of empire. Empire was still writ large in my mind. I was read on the Boy's Own Paper, which is an imperial product, you know. Anyway, I think the army allowed you to state your preference in order to actually put you in the very opposite of what you wanted to do. So I ended up in the Royal Army Pay Corps. I never knew there was such an establishment. And I was the last person to put into a Pay Corps. I knew nothing about accountancy, or I was even lousy at maths. But it was fun, again. And instead of being posted overseas, we were sent to Footscray in Kent. And quartered in the gloomy old barracks at Woolwich with the very people whose pay we were supposed to be accounting for, whom they hated us because they always suspected us of cheating them, you know, these gunners of the Royal Artillery. And we lived in a little separate enclave and did our best to goad them, and there was a kind of constant feud. They were dreadful old barracks. I mean, they were so ancient. They'd been built virtually at the time of Waterloo. And there was no heating. In the middle of winter, all you had was a fireplace, traditional fireplace, and an enormous barrack room. So if you weren't lucky enough to have your bunk bed by the fireplace, you'd die of cold, you know. And we'd go down and for the ablutions and knock the icicles off the taps. They were so cold. There was no hot water. They filmed something called Beau Geste while I was there, a movie called Beau Geste, all about the Prince Regent and set in the Regency days. And Woolwich Barracks had existed then, so they didn't have to change a thing. It was exactly as it had been.
And so did you enjoy your time in the national service? Or?
Well, of course, I made so many friends. I had always been an introvert, a terrible introvert. I suppose because of my sexual orientation, basically, and afraid of joining gangs and groups and shunning any kind of sporting activity. But when I entered national service, I decided to throw away all those childish things and grow up. And I plunged headlong into the business of making friends. And I proved very successful at it. I made an awful lot of friends. I can't remember a single one in my barrack room that I didn't like. And it was great, because we used to visit each other's homes. We used to go to Manchester, Portsmouth, and they'd come and stay with me at the weekends. And I had a wonderful time, great friends, and I've stayed in touch with some of them too. But it was disappointing not to go overseas. I particularly wanted to go to Malaya, because the emergency was still on there, and I'd always loved the tropics. Of course, missed India. And after my 2 years national service, which actually I was very sorry to leave. I think it was the best thing for me. And I wish they'd continued providing national service, because I can't think of a better grounding for a young man. I went back to newspapers. I went from the Bexhill-on-Sea Observer back to the same newspaper group, but this time with the Hastings Observer, just in time to cover Winston Churchill's visit to Hastings with Montgomery of Desert Rats fame to be inducted into the Hastings Winkle Club. And we were so short-staffed in the Hastings Observer, we were spread thin, you know, everyone was appointed to do some important part of this busy day, and I was assigned the speech that Winnie was supposed to deliver in the White Rock Pavilion, which you will remember. And I was absolutely terrified because I'd lost all of my shorthand. After 2 years of not practicing it, it became a kind of slow scrawl. And you know how slowly Winston used to speak? I couldn't keep up with him. All the hacks from London were of course sailing through it, you know, jotting it down. But I was struggling, you know, at least 2 or 3 sentences behind. And I thought, oh my God, I'm going to lose my job over this. I'm never going to be able to give them a complete, clean edit of what he said. This was a humorous, entertaining speech by Winston Churchill would go down in the public records, and I didn't have a note of it. So afterwards, Winnie and Monty was the mayor and the municipal council in the foyer of the White Rock Pavilion. And I was trying to edge my way forward to try and beg, steal or borrow Winnie's speech. And Monty caught my eye and sort of raised a questioning eyebrow and sort of summoned me over. I explained my predicament, and he tapped Winnie on the shoulder. And without breaking wind from his speech, you know, Winnie just calmly continued speaking and fished out from his inside jacket pocket the speech. The original speech with his handwritten annotations. I was so great, I could have bowed and scraped my way out of the pavilion and rushed back to the office, where I stupidly brandished this trophy and said, I've actually got Winnie's speech with his handwritten notes. That was the last I saw of it. The editor seized it, and there it was. But what was interesting about it was the fact that Winston, of course, was a journalist himself, and he wrote on landscape sheet papers, you know, not A4 size, but horizontal, double line spacing, typing, with all the pauses, those pregnant pauses in his sentences, marked by little full stops. And the longer the pause, the more the full stops. And occasionally, with his pencil, he had changed a word or two. This is fascinating. You know, a wonderful insight into the way he prepared his speeches.
And so, at this point in time, you were certain that you wanted to go into journalism as a career full-time?
Yes. Well, I couldn't see any other opportunity open to me. I'd got that far, and there was kind of no turning back, really. But the question was, could I continue to do this in Britain? And Britain was getting staler and staler for me. I went to from the Hastings Observer, I went to the East Sussex Express and County Herald, which had its headquarters in Lewes and served the whole of East Sussex. And I became their Rye correspondent, which was a lovely posting. I should have been grateful for it and made the most of it, but ungrateful creature that I was, I didn't like Rye, despite its wonderful history and, you know, its place. It's a charming town. Artists gather there. I was fortunate to be there, and I didn't appreciate how lucky I was. I was there, I guess, for nearly 2 years. Sending in my stories phoning them usually, to the office in Lewes. And I was an incredibly forgetful person. I would often go to the phone box, get out my wallet for the change and keep feeding the slot machine while I laboured over reciting my prose to the man at the other end. And then I'd put the phone down and walk out, leaving my wallet lying there. And I did this twice. And the police would ring up my landlady, Mrs. Bannister, her name was, to say I'd done it again. I'd left my wallet in the phone box. So I'd go round and penitently promise never to do it again, Nothing missing. Rye was like that. It was a very safe place. Mrs. Bannister was an absolute cure. She was a delightful working class lady from the upstairs downstairs days who'd saved up enough as a maid to buy her own boarding house, and she ran it like a military barracks. We had to be on time, we had to behave ourselves. She was great fun. She was a very large, dumpy woman. And we'd sit down to breakfast and eat her massive slices of bread and scrambled egg and bursting sausages while she laboured over the spitting stove of hers. And her husband, Bill, would walk in with a chamber pot on his head for a stunt, He was, and she would scream at him, "How dare you, Bill Bannister, do this again, showing us up." We weren't allowed to touch her television set. We couldn't even touch the knobs. It was so sacred. And she hated going out in the street in her false teeth. She had a hat stand in the hallway, and she would don every item of apparel, down to the scarf round her neck and the hat on her head. And last of all, she would insert the false teeth, which was sitting like some sacrament in an altar piece. And you couldn't speak to her while she had her false teeth in, because she could only mumble. She was so afraid the teeth would fall out. And then she'd go off into the street, and she'd dread being accosted by a neighbour and made to listen at length to this neighbour's tale of woe while she could only mumble. It was a delight to see her come back, and the first thing she did was remove the false teeth and speak again. Wow, what a relief that was. And then she'd discard her other items of clothing, but no, she was a funny woman. I once had to interview a Kikuyu bishop from Kenya at the time when the Kikuyu uprisings, Mau Mau uprisings, were still in progress. And he was making a little tour of England as a guest priest and parson at various Anglican churches. And he was so interesting, I really had to get him to myself, but he could only spare enough time to visit me in my lodgings. So I went back and said to Mrs. Bannister, "I hope you don't mind, but I've got this Kikuyu bishop." And she said, "A what bishop?" And I explained he was from Kenya. "Is he a black man?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "I'm not having any black man in this house. Nope, I've never had one in my life, and not going to happen now." So I didn't know what to do. He was arriving by taxi any moment. I was out on the pavement. Mrs. Bannister at the top of the steps behind me, arms akimbo like this, scowling, with her false teeth in and everything. And taxi arrived, and I was about to explain to the bishop as he was getting out about Mrs. Bannister, and he went past me and rushed up the stairs with his arm out. "Mrs. Bannister, what an absolute delight to meet you. I've heard so much about you." Well, she melted, of course. And she couldn't wait to get him into the saloon, which was out of bounds to the rest of us. It was the front room where only very honoured guests were received. So I didn't get a chance to interview him until she'd finished with him. And that was her first experience of a black man. Oh, it's a funny lady. You know, when I arrived with my typewriter, she asked me, "What's that? Are you taking that up to your room?" And I said, "Yes, it's my typewriter." And she said, "Are you going to use that to write things?" And I said, "Yes, it's, you know, it's what I do." And she said, "I'm not having your ink splattered over my lovely lilac wallpaper." She really thought that when I pressed the key, the ink would go flying all around the room. Oh dear.
And so Rye at that time, was it quite working class area?
It was in that part where I lived, on the road out to Winchelsea. And of course on the hill cluttered the Mermaid Street crowd and the artist community and so on and so forth, and the cobble streets. A delightful town. I like going back there now.
And what did you do on the weekends and in your leisure time in Rye?
Well, the office equipped me with a scooter, a Lambretta, which was fairly new in Britain in those days. And I used to go for miles on this Lambretta. I had a large territory to cover, all the villages around Rye. So I putted around on this Lambretta and went miles on it. I even went, on one occasion, right over to Salisbury to stay with my family there. So my escape was seeing the countryside, but basically just reading and yearning for the day when I could get out of England.